Picture a city perched on the edge of the Mediterranean, its stone walls battered by sea spray and stained with the smoke of countless conflicts, a place so vital that its very name could shift the balance of empires. This was Acre, the last great Christian bastion in the Holy Land, a prize so coveted that it drew the attention of one of history's most brilliant commanders, Saladin. By the late 12th century, he had united vast territories under his banner, outmaneuvered his enemies in spectacular fashion, and earned a reputation as a strategic mastermind. Yet here, at the height of his power, he faced a challenge that would test every ounce of his genius and ultimately reveal that even the most carefully laid plans can crumble in the face of chaos, chance, and human limitation. What unfolds is not just a tale of clashing armies and towering siege engines, but a deeply human story of ambition, perseverance, and miscalculation. How could a leader as gifted as Saladin, a man who had rewritten the rules of warfare, stumble so profoundly before the walls of this stubborn city? The answer lies not in one single error, but in a cascade of unforeseen complications, supply lines stretched to breaking point, rivalries simmering within his own ranks, the arrival of unexpected reinforcements, and the sheer stubbornness of defenders who refused to yield. This was more than a military engagement. It was a vortex of logistics, leadership, and luck that would come to define an era. Join us as we venture back to the dusty plains and crowded encampments outside Acre, where hope gradually gave way to grim determination, and where a campaign that began with certainty ended in sobering lessons for generations to come. We'll explore how grand visions are tempered by reality, how strategy must bow to supply, and why some failures echo louder than victories. This is the story of the Siege of Acre, a dramatic episode that teaches us as much about the art of the possible as it does about the dreams that lie just beyond our grasp. To understand the sheer weight of this confrontation, we must first step back and survey the chessboard of the late 12th century. For nearly 100 years, a precarious and often bloody status quo had existed in the Levant. European crusaders held onto a narrow strip of coastal territory, a series of fragile kingdoms propped up by a constant trickle of pilgrims, traders, and soldiers from the west. On the other side, the Muslim world, though powerful, had long been divided among competing dynasties and warlords. This all changed with the rise of one man. Saladin, a Kurdish military leader, achieved what many thought was impossible. Through a combination of shrewd diplomacy, battlefield prowess, and a powerful unifying message, he welded the fractured Islamic Emirates into a single, formidable force under his command. His stunning victory at the Battle of Hatton in 1187 was a catastrophe for the Crusader states, shattering their armies and allowing him to recapture Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of the conflict. This sent shockwaves throughout Christendom, sparking urgent calls for a new major crusade. But in the immediate aftermath of Hatton, the entire Crusader project was hanging by a thread. Their field army was destroyed, their king captured, and their most sacred city lost. All that remained were a few heavily fortified coastal cities, and the most vital of these was Acre. This was not just another port. Acre was the primary gateway to the Holy Land. It was where ships from Italy, France, and England would disembark their knights, their supplies, and their treasure. It was the logistical lifeline without which any hope of reconquering Jerusalem was pure fantasy. For the Crusaders, holding Acre meant survival. For Saladin, its capture would mean finally slamming that gateway shut, Chinese letter, isolating the remaining Christian outposts and cutting the head off the snake of European resistance. He knew that as long as Acre stood, it was a beacon, a rallying point for the massive new crusade he knew was being organized in the west. The city had become the single most strategic objective on the map, a symbol of resilience for one side and an unfinished task for the other. This wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a battle for the future of the entire Crusader presence in the east. The stage was set not just for a siege, but for an epic clash of civilizations, with the fate of kingdoms resting on the outcome of the struggle for this one city. Saladin's reputation as a military genius was not built on mere legend. It was forged in the crucible of decisive victories, none more stunning than the Battle of Hatton. There, in the scorching summer of 1187, he didn't just defeat the Crusader army, he orchestrated its utter destruction. His strategy was a masterclass in understanding his enemy and the terrain. He lured the overconfident, heavily armored Crusader knights into a waterless trap under the relentless sun. By controlling the wells and high ground, he turned their greatest strength, their heavy cavalry charge, into a fatal weakness. His troops, mostly light cavalry and archers, harried the parched and exhausted Christians, refusing to engage in a pitched battle until the moment was perfect. This was not brute force, it was a surgical application of pressure, a psychological and physical dismantling of a superior force. Hatton showcased his core principles: patience, meticulous planning, and an uncanny ability to manipulate his opponent's decisions. But his brilliance extended far beyond the battlefield. Saladin was a master of the human element, a leader who commanded fierce loyalty not just through victory, but through character and generosity. He cultivated an image of chivalry and honor that often unnerved his European adversaries, who expected a savage infidel. He understood that morale was a weapon. After Hatton, he personally offered a cup of iced water to the defeated King Guy of Jerusalem, a gesture that was both merciful and profoundly demoralizing to the captive's supporters. He built a vast intelligence network of spies and scouts that provided him with detailed knowledge of enemy movements and internal disputes long before they reached the field. This allowed him to adapt his strategies with astonishing speed, always seeming to be one step ahead. He was a virtuoso of psychological warfare, using feigned retreats to break enemy formations and spreading rumors to sow discord within fortress walls. His adaptability was perhaps his greatest asset. He was not wedded to a single style of combat. If a direct assault was too costly, he would opt for a protracted blockade. If an enemy was strong in one area, he would probe for weakness in another. He unified disparate and often rival Muslim factions under a common cause, blending their forces into a cohesive army through the sheer force of his personality and a shared religious zeal. He was, by all accounts, the complete package: a strategist, a logistician, a diplomat, and an inspirational figurehead. His forces were not just fighting for territory, they were fighting for him. This formidable combination of skills had made him the unifier of the Muslim Near East and the scourge of the Crusader states. He was, it seemed, invincible. Yet the very scale of his previous successes set the stage for his greatest challenge. The Siege of Acre would demand a different kind of warfare, a grueling, slow, and resource-intensive struggle against a fixed position and a determined enemy with an open sea at its back. The brilliant maneuvers of Hatton were of limited use against thick stone walls. The loyalty of his emirs would be tested not by a swift campaign of movement, but by the grinding misery of a 2-year stalemate. His famed adaptability would be stretched to its absolute limit, forced to contend with problems no amount of tactical genius could easily solve: rampant disease, failing supply lines, and the unpredictable arrival of powerful new enemies from across the sea. The cracks in this masterpiece of command were about to show, not through a sudden failure of skill, but through the slow, inexorable pressure of a situation that defied even his unparalleled talents. To grasp why this city became the focal point of such an immense and prolonged struggle, we have to see it not just as a dot on a map, but as the beating heart of the entire Crusader enterprise. After the disaster at Hatton and the loss of Jerusalem, the remaining Crusader territories were like a body in shock, clinging to life. Their inland castles and towns were now isolated and vulnerable, cut off from each other and from any hope of salvation. The only thing keeping this fragile body alive was a thin, coastal artery, the port cities through which the lifeblood of men, money, and materials from Europe could still flow. And of these ports, Acre was by far the largest, the most fortified, and the most vital. It was the grand central station of the Levant. Strategically, its location was a masterpiece of medieval urban planning, a natural fortress. It was built on a peninsula surrounded on three sides by the sea. Its massive double walls, studded with formidable towers like the fearsome Accursed Tower, were a nightmare for any attacking force. But its true power wasn't just in its defenses, it was in its harbor. This was one of the best natural harbors on the entire eastern Mediterranean coast. It could shelter an entire fleet from storms and host the deep-drafted transport ships that brought knights, their war horses, and endless shiploads of supplies from Cyprus, Sicily, and Italy. For the Crusaders holed up inside, this harbor was their umbilical cord to the outside world. As long as it remained open, they could withstand a siege almost indefinitely, receiving food, weapons, and fresh troops while the besiegers outside slowly starved and withered under the sun. For Saladin, this geographical reality presented his single greatest strategic problem. His monumental victory was incomplete. He held the holy city of Jerusalem, yes, but the Crusader presence was not eradicated. It was wounded, cornered, but still dangerous, and as long as Acre stood, it was a beacon, a rallying point. He knew it was only a matter of time before the kings of Europe answered the Pope's call for a new crusade. Their armies would need a safe place to land, a secure base from which to operate. That place was Acre. If he could capture it, he would achieve two monumental goals. First, he'd WOULD Chinese letter sever that lifeline, finally isolating and strangling the remaining Crusader states. Towns like Tyre and Tripoli would wither on the vine without resupply. Second, and just as importantly, he would slam the door shut on any new European army. They would have no safe harbor, no beachhead. They would be forced to land on open, hostile beaches, vulnerable and disorganized, making them easy prey for his forces. Taking Acre was the final, necessary step to secure his conquests and make the reconquest of Jerusalem permanent. This is what made the prize so incredibly tempting, but it also defined the immense difficulty of the task. To succeed, Saladin needed to achieve what was, by the military technology of the time, nearly impossible. He had to find a way to seal off a city that had an open back door to the sea. A traditional land siege where you surround a city and wait for starvation to do its work was utterly futile here. The defenders could always be fed by ship. This meant he had to somehow project power onto the water without a navy of any significance. He had to find a way to break through those legendary walls, which would require vast resources, specialized engineers, and precious time during which the very European reinforcements he feared could arrive. The strategic importance of Acre was therefore a double-edged sword. Its value made it an absolute necessity for him to capture, but the very features that made it so valuable, its fortifications and its seaport, also made it one of the most daunting military objectives in the entire world. He was committing to a high-stakes game against a clock he could not control, for a reward that promised total victory, but a challenge that demanded nothing less than perfection. And so, with the strategic imperative clear and his confidence soaring, Saladin moved to apply his formidable will to the walls of Acre. The opening phase of the siege was a masterful display of his military prowess, a whirlwind of action that seemed to confirm every ounce of his legendary reputation. His armies swept into position with astonishing speed, effectively cutting the city off from the landward side. His cavalry fanned out, intercepting supply caravans and harrying any who dared approach, while his engineers began the meticulous work of constructing massive siege engines trebuchets that would soon begin hurling enormous stones against the city's formidable defenses. The air filled with the thunderous crash of impact and the shouts of men, a symphony of impending victory. Inside the city, the atmosphere was one of sheer desperation. The defenders, a mix of terrified citizens, determined knights, and Italian mariners, were caught in a vice. Saladin's reputation preceded him, and the memory of Hatton cast a long shadow, sowing a deep psychological fear. The relentless bombardment from his siege weapons breached sections of the outer walls, and his troops launched wave after wave of coordinated assaults, testing every weak point in the defenses. For a time, it seemed the city might fall within weeks, perhaps even days. The Muslim camp buzzed with a palpable sense of imminent triumph. Chroniclers of the time wrote of the confidence coursing through Saladin's army. They believed they were on the cusp of delivering the final, crushing blow to the Christian presence in the Holy Land. The swiftness of their advance and the sheer force of their pressure created an illusion of inevitability. This early momentum, however, was a dazzling mirage. The very speed and ferocity of the initial assault concealed a series of critical vulnerabilities that would soon be exposed. The focus was entirely on the landward siege, on breaking the walls and overwhelming the garrison. Yet that vital harbor remained open and unconquered. While Saladin's forces were preoccupied with the land walls, Christian ships continued to slip in and out of the port, bringing in crucial supplies and intelligence. The defenders, though battered, were not yet broken. They used the brief respites between assaults to patch breaches and shore up their defenses, their will hardening with each passing day. The early successes had created a dangerous overconfidence in the besieging camp, blinding them to the reality that they were engaged in a race against time, a race that would be won not by the first furious sprint, but by a long, grueling marathon of endurance for which they were woefully unprepared. The easy victory they anticipated was already slipping through their fingers, replaced by the grim prospect of a stalemate they could ill afford. The initial momentum of the siege began to evaporate as the seasons turned, replaced by a grinding, brutal reality that no amount of tactical genius could easily solve. Saladin's vast army, a magnificent instrument of war on the open field, was now trapped in a static position, and the colossal machinery of its supply chain began to groan under the strain. The very land that had been his ally at Hatton now became his adversary. His supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to Damascus and Egypt, a precarious thread of camel caravans and ox-drawn carts vulnerable to every conceivable threat. Local bandits, hostile Christian patrols from nearby Tyre, and even the harsh, unpredictable terrain itself conspired to disrupt the flow of essentials. A convoy delayed by a washed-out road or an ambush meant thousands of men went hungry that night. The problem wasn't just quantity, but consistency. A feast one week could be followed by a famine the next, creating a cycle of uncertainty that gnawed at the army's discipline. Within the sprawling Muslim encampment, conditions deteriorated from difficult to dire. The concentration of tens of thousands of men, horses, and other animals in a confined space created a perfect storm for disease. Sanitation was a constant losing battle. Latrine pits overflowed, contaminating water sources and providing a breeding ground for flies and infection. Dysentery, typhoid, and other camp fevers ran rampant, striking down seasoned warriors as effectively as any enemy arrow. The sick and wounded, who might have recovered with proper rest and care, found themselves in crowded, filthy tents with dwindling medical supplies. Morale, once sky-high with the promise of a quick victory, began a slow, steady decline. Soldiers who had signed up for a glorious campaign found themselves mired in the mud and misery of a protracted blockade, their spirits eroded by hunger, illness, and the demoralizing sight of Christian ships sailing unmolested into the harbor with fresh supplies. This was the fundamental, asymmetrical weakness of Saladin's position. The defenders of Acre, though under constant pressure, enjoyed a luxury he could not match: strategic depth via the sea. Their world was not shrinking, it was expanding. Every ship that slipped past the ineffective Muslim naval blockade brought not just food and weapons, but also news, hope, and the tangible proof that they were not forgotten. They could rotate their defenders, bring in fresh mercenaries, and repair their walls with materials delivered directly to their docks. Saladin's army, in stark contrast, was slowly consuming itself. Every arrow fired was one that had to be painstakingly transported from a distant workshop. Every sack of grain eaten was one that had to be replaced by a perilous overland journey. The once formidable siege engines fell silent for lack of suitable stone, and the engineers tasked with building new ones found their materials diverted to more immediate needs like shoring up camp defenses against sorties. The brilliant strategist was being forced into the role of a quartermaster, his attention divided between grand tactics and the grim daily calculus of rationing and resource allocation. The great campaign of conquest was devolving into a dismal war of attrition, and with every passing day, the logistical advantage tilted further in favor of the men behind the walls. Just as the defenders' resolve began to wear thin and Saladin's forces were preparing for what they hoped would be the final assault, the horizon over the Mediterranean began to change. At first, it was just a few specks, then a growing forest of masts and sails. The vanguard of the Third Crusade had arrived. This was not a trickle of reinforcements but a flood, a massive infusion of men, material, and most importantly, legendary leadership that would completely rewrite the equation of the siege. The first major contingent was led by King Guy of Jerusalem, recently ransomed by Saladin himself in an act of chivalry that would now come back to haunt him. Guy's arrival in the summer of 1189 with a force of several thousand was a critical morale boost for the beleaguered garrison, but it was only the beginning. The true game changers arrived in the following years, figures whose names would echo through history. In the spring of 1191, King Philip Augustus of France landed with his army, bringing with him the full might of European engineering and feudal military organization. His forces were disciplined, well-equipped, and accompanied by master craftsmen who immediately began constructing a new generation of massive counter-siege weapons. These trebuchets and mangonels were not just defensive tools. They were designed to outrange and overwhelm Saladin's own artillery, systematically dismantling the siege works that had taken his engineers months to build. Then, in June of that same year, the most formidable of them all arrived, Richard the Lionheart, King of England. His reputation as a warrior king preceded him, and his arrival was a spectacle of martial power. His fleet disgorged not only a corps of heavily armored knights and veteran longbowmen, but also a revolutionary prefabricated siege castle, transported across the sea in pieces to be assembled on the spot. This mobile fortress, nicknamed Bad Neighbor or Malvoisin, was a terrifying instrument of war, a towering wooden structure that could be rolled up to the city's outer defenses to allow his archers to rain death down upon the Muslim besiegers from a position of near impunity. More crucially, Richard brought with him absolute control of the sea. His English and Norman fleets established a naval blockade so effective that they could not only resupply Acre at will, but also prevent any Muslim ships from providing relief to Saladin's own increasingly strained army. This sudden reversal of fortune was a masterclass in the importance of strategic depth and sea power. Saladin, for all his genius, was a land-based commander. His attempts to challenge the Crusader fleet were sporadic and ineffective, relying on small galleys and fireships that were easily brushed aside by the larger, more numerous European warships. The sea, which had been Acre's lifeline, now became its shield and its sword. The Crusaders, once trapped between the city walls and Saladin's army, now used their naval supremacy to launch coordinated amphibious assaults, hitting the Muslim flank from the beaches and forcing Saladin to stretch his lines even thinner. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the military one. For 2 years, Saladin's army had been the hunter, patiently tightening the noose. Now, in a matter of months, they found themselves on the defensive, their camp itself under constant threat from sorties from the city and attacks from the newly landed Crusader host. The arrival of these legendary European kings shattered the aura of inevitability that had surrounded Saladin's campaign. It introduced an element of chance, a variable that no amount of planning could have fully anticipated. The timing was exquisitely cruel for the Muslim cause. It was the moment of their greatest strain that their enemy received its greatest reinforcement. This dramatic shift underscores a timeless lesson of warfare and strategy. That brilliance in planning and execution can still be undone by factors beyond one's control, where the fortunes of timing and the arrival of new players on the board can reshape the entire landscape of a conflict in an instant. The very structure that had been the source of Saladin's strength began to show its weaknesses under the unrelenting pressure of the siege. His army was not a single, monolithic force but a grand coalition, a tapestry of contingents from across his empire, each led by its own emir or regional commander who owed allegiance to Saladin but also guarded their own authority and the interests of their men. This system, which had worked so well in swift, decisive campaigns where victory brought immediate spoils and glory, began to fray during the long, grueling stalemate outside Acre. The shared purpose that had united them began to fragment under the strain of hunger, disease, and the frustrating lack of progress. Rivalries that had been suppressed for the greater good began to resurface, and the chain of command, once clear and responsive, became tangled and slow. This fragmentation led to disastrous miscoordination on the battlefield. A planned, coordinated assault required precise timing, a feint from one wing to draw defenders away, followed by a main thrust against a weakened point. Yet time and again, these complex maneuvers fell apart. One contingent, perhaps eager for glory or fearing a loss of face, would launch its attack prematurely, spoiling the element of surprise for everyone else. Another, hearing the sounds of combat and assuming the assault had begun in earnest, would charge in as well, but without the intended support, turning a planned pincer movement into a series of piecemeal, easily repulsed attacks. Messengers carrying crucial orders had to navigate a chaotic labyrinth of trenches and separate camp compounds, and delays of even an hour could mean the difference between a breakthrough and a bloody repulse. There are accounts from chroniclers of Saladin's frustration, watching from a hilltop as a golden opportunity evaporated because a key unit failed to move into position, either through a misunderstood order, a deliberate hesitation, or simply because the commander was not present with his troops at the critical moment. The problem was compounded by the very nature of medieval communication. There were no radios, no instant updates. Saladin's command and control was limited to what he could see with his own eyes or what his scouts could report back. The fog of war was thick, and in that fog, rumors and misinformation flourished. A sortie from the city gates might be exaggerated into a full-scale breakout, causing entire divisions to brace for an attack that never materialized, wasting energy and resources. Conversely, a genuine crisis in one part of the line might be downplayed by a local commander reluctant to admit weakness, allowing a small breach to become a major problem before Saladin even knew it existed. This lack of a unified, real-time picture meant he was often reacting to events rather than directing them, a frustrating position for a commander whose genius lay in his proactive orchestration of the battlefield. The brilliant strategist was being hamstrung not by a lack of ideas, but by a breakdown in the essential machinery of execution, the seamless flow of information, and the willing, coordinated action of all its parts. The army was still powerful, but it was no longer a perfectly tuned instrument. It was becoming a collection of talented but dissonant voices, and the symphony of siege warfare descended into a cacophony of wasted effort and missed chances. Beyond the walls and the weapons, beyond the strategies of kings and commanders, lay an enemy that neither side could control or fully predict: the relentless and unforgiving environment of the Levant. The Siege of Acre became a brutal war of attrition, not just against human foes, but against the very elements, and in this struggle, the defenders held a distinct and ultimately decisive advantage. The coastal plain around the city was a landscape of extremes, subjecting Saladin's vast army to a cycle of punishing weather that eroded their strength and their will as effectively as any Crusader charge. The campaign stretched across multiple years, each season bringing its own unique brand of misery. The summers were a particular trial. The sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling Muslim encampment, baking the ground into a hard, cracked clay and turning the air inside tents into a suffocating furnace. For soldiers clad in chainmail and padding, the risk of heatstroke was a constant, deadly companion. Water, always a precious commodity, became a source of intense anxiety. The local springs and streams were quickly exhausted or contaminated by the waste of thousands of men and animals, forcing reliance on water hauled from distant sources. This logistical nightmare was compounded by the swarms of insects that thrived in the heat, spreading disease and adding a maddening layer of torment to the soldiers' existence. The Crusaders inside the city walls, by contrast, had better access to deep, protected cisterns and wells, and the stone buildings offered some respite from the oppressive heat. Then, with a suddenness that could catch entire supply columns off guard, the seasons would turn. The autumn rains arrived, transforming the landscape from a dust bowl into a treacherous sea of mud. The terrain around Acre, already churned up by the movement of men and siege engines, became a quagmire. This was a catastrophe for logistics. The vital supply routes from Damascus and other interior cities, which were difficult to maintain even in ideal conditions, became nearly impassable. Heavy ox carts laden with grain and weapons would sink axle-deep in the mire, delaying convoys for days or weeks. There are accounts of entire shipments of food spoiling after being caught in unexpected downpours, their precious cargo ruined by water and mud. For the soldiers in the trenches, life became a wet, cold, and miserable ordeal. Trench foot and respiratory illnesses flourished in the damp conditions, adding to the hospital tents already overflowing with the wounded and those stricken by dysentery. The winter brought its own challenges, with colder temperatures and stormy winds blowing in from the Mediterranean, making life in the open field a test of endurance. The Crusader defenders, however, were largely insulated from these worst effects. They slept under solid roofs, their stores were kept dry in fortified warehouses, and they could rotate their fighting men off the walls to rest in relative comfort. This environmental asymmetry wore down the besieging army in a slow, relentless grind. While Saladin's troops were expending energy just to survive the elements battling heat, thirst, mud, and cold, the defenders could conserve their strength for the military defense of the city. Nature, in its impartial way, had effectively joined the fight on the side of the garrison, acting as a force multiplier for the defenders and a constant drain on the attackers. It was a stark reminder that the greatest general with the most brilliant plan is always at the mercy of the weather, and that a campaign timetable drawn up in a comfortable tent can be rendered utterly useless by one unexpected rainstorm at the wrong time. While the physical hardships of the siege were immense, an even more insidious enemy was at work within the minds of Saladin's soldiers. The initial fervor that had carried them to the walls of Acre, a blend of religious zeal and confidence in their legendary commander, slowly curdled into a deep and pervasive disillusionment. The campaign, which many had believed would be over in a matter of weeks, had stretched into a second year with no end in sight. This grinding stagnation created a fertile ground for despair, and the defenders inside Acre proved to be adept psychological warriors, keenly exploiting this vulnerability. The Crusaders understood that a siege is a battle of wills as much as a battle of arms. They used every opportunity to taunt and demoralize their besiegers. From the safety of the ramparts, they would stage elaborate displays of defiance, feasting in full view of the hungry Muslim lines, throwing fresh bread over the walls to show their abundance, or parading captured banners and equipment to mock their enemies' failures. These acts were calculated insults designed to erode the spirit of the men watching from the dusty plains below. Even more effective were the occasional, daring sorties. A small group of knights would burst from a sally port, wreak havoc on an unprepared section of the siege works, and retreat back behind the walls before a proper counterattack could be organized. These small tactical victories were minor in a military sense, but their psychological impact was enormous. For the defenders, it was a tremendous boost, proof that they were not just passive victims. For the besiegers, each successful sortie was a humiliating reminder of their own impotence, a sign that they were the ones trapped in a deadly, exhausting holding pattern. Meanwhile, within Saladin's camp, a dangerous nostalgia began to take root. Soldiers far from home, suffering from disease and deprivation, naturally began to romanticize the lives they had left behind. Stories circulated of comfortable homes, peaceful villages, and families waiting, a stark contrast to the grim reality of the siege lines. This longing for normalcy slowly chipped away at their commitment to the cause. The abstract goal of capturing a distant city began to pale in comparison to the immediate, visceral desire for safety and comfort. This homesickness was a poison to discipline, and it found its ultimate expression in the quiet, shameful act of desertion. Under the cover of darkness, men would simply slip away from their posts, abandoning the grand enterprise to save themselves. These desertions were rarely in large numbers, but their effect was corrosive. Each disappearance sent a silent, powerful message to those who remained, that some had already decided this fight was not worth dying for. The trust and cohesion that are the bedrock of any army began to fracture as soldiers looked at their comrades with a new suspicion, wondering who might be the next to vanish into the night. Saladin, for all his skills as a motivator, found himself fighting a rearguard action against this tide of despair. He could promise future glory, but his men were living in a miserable present. He could speak of divine favor, but they saw only disease and stalemate. The defenders, though physically confined, held a psychological advantage, sustained by the sea-born hope of reinforcement and the defiant energy of those fighting for their very survival. This stark contrast in mental state became a decisive, if invisible, front in the war. It demonstrated a timeless truth of conflict, that an army's breaking point is often not a physical wall, but the collective will of its soldiers, and once that spirit is broken, no amount of strategic genius can easily glue it back together. Saladin's initial investment in siege technology represented a massive commitment of resources and expertise, designed to deliver a decisive blow. His engineers constructed massive counterweight trebuchets, towering wooden giants that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds against Acre's formidable walls, day and night. Alongside these, his sappers began the perilous work of mining, tunneling beneath the foundations to weaken them with wooden supports that would then be set ablaze, collapsing the tunnels and hopefully bringing a section of the wall down with them. For a time, these tactics seemed to promise success, creating breaches and shaking the defenders' confidence. The psychological impact of seeing their seemingly impregnable walls crumble under such relentless, engineered force was a weapon in itself. Yet, the defenders were far from passive recipients of this bombardment. The very nature of a siege creates a unique laboratory for innovation, where necessity becomes the mother of invention under the most extreme pressure. The Crusaders inside Acre, a mix of military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers, Italian engineers, and experienced sailors, proved to be remarkably resourceful and quick learners. They didn't just repair the damage, they actively evolved their defenses to counter each new threat. When Saladin's trebuchets found their range, the Crusaders didn't only rebuild the shattered masonry. They constructed their own artillery emplacements on the walls, building protective wooden housings around their mangonels to shield their crews and allow them to return fire with surprising accuracy. This turned the bombardment into a brutal artillery duel, a noisy, destructive exchange that consumed vast quantities of precious stone ammunition on both sides with no clear winner. The battle beneath the ground was even more intense and claustrophobic. Saladin's miners, working in dark, cramped tunnels, faced a terrifying new defense, counter-mining. The Crusaders, suspecting where the enemy sappers might be digging, would begin their own tunnels to intercept them. When the two tunnels met, the result was not a dramatic collapse but a horrific, close-quarters fight in pitch-black, narrow passages, a brutal subterranean war fought with picks, knives, and clubs. The Crusaders also developed clever acoustic methods to detect mining activity, placing bowls of water on the ground to watch for ripples or listening for the faint, telltale sounds of digging. Once a mine was located, they could sabotage it from their own tunnel or simply dig a counter-trench behind the threatened section of wall, rendering the impending collapse far less effective. This underground chess match was a massive drain on manpower and morale, a dirty, dangerous, and invisible struggle that yielded very little for the immense effort expended. Perhaps the most symbolically potent weapon in Saladin's arsenal was Greek fire, the mysterious, napalm-like incendiary compound that could burn even on water. Its deployment was meant to be a terror weapon to set siege engines ablaze and spread panic among the defenders, but once again the Crusaders adapted. They developed and deployed advanced firefighting techniques, using vinegar-soaked hides and sand to smother the stubborn flames. More importantly, they turned the terror back on its creators. Using their own projectile engines, they launched pots of Greek fire, which they had either captured, replicated, or acquired from their own Byzantine contacts back into the Muslim siege lines, setting their carefully constructed wooden towers and artillery pieces ablaze. This technological tit-for-tat created a costly and frustrating stalemate. Every ingenious offensive measure was met with an equally ingenious defensive countermeasure, forcing both sides to invest more and more resources, time, and brainpower into an escalating arms race that consumed materials and energy at an alarming rate without producing a decisive advantage. This deadlock became a war of economic and industrial attrition. For Saladin, the cost was exponentially higher. His siege engines, built from timber hauled over long distances, were complex, valuable assets. Watching one be destroyed by a well-aimed Crusader stone or a pot of Greek fire meant not just a tactical setback, but a significant financial and logistical loss. The specialized engineers needed to build and operate these machines were a scarce and irreplaceable resource. The Crusaders, by contrast, had a crucial advantage: their open sea lanes. While Saladin's engineers had to make do with whatever materials could be brought overland, the defenders could import not just finished weapons, but also specialized components, skilled military architects from Italy, and even prefabricated parts for their own siege engines. Their ability to innovate and replace losses was simply faster and more sustainable. This dynamic demonstrated a profound and frustrating lesson for Saladin: that technological superiority is not a static advantage but a fleeting one. An opponent with the will and the means to adapt can quickly close the gap, turning a master's tools against him and transforming a campaign of decisive maneuver into a grinding, resource-draining stalemate where the first side to exhaust its ingenuity or its treasury is the one that loses. While the stalemate at the walls of Acre was a visible and bloody affair, a far quieter yet equally devastating battle was being waged in the treasuries and marketplaces of Saladin's empire. The glorious campaign to crush the last Christian stronghold was rapidly becoming an economic black hole, consuming wealth on a scale that even a unified sultanate could not sustain indefinitely. An army of tens of thousands, along with its thousands of horses, camels, and support personnel, required a constant river of gold and silver to keep it in the field. Every single day, funds were needed to pay the wages of professional soldiers and vital mercenaries, to purchase fodder for the animals, to commission new siege engines from carpenters and engineers, and to replace the countless arrows, stones, and other munitions being expended in the daily artillery duels. This was not a one-time cost, it was a relentless, ever-mounting financial hemorrhage. To meet these crippling expenses, Saladin was forced to resort to measures that began to erode the very foundation of his support. Heavy new taxes were levied across his domains, from the fertile fields of Egypt to the trading cities of Syria. These impositions fell hardest on the common people and the merchant classes, who had initially supported the war effort with patriotic fervor. But as the siege dragged on with no victory in sight, that fervor turned to resentment. The grand cause of driving the Crusaders into the sea began to feel like a distant abstraction compared to the very real and immediate hardship of emptied grain stores and confiscated profits. Discontent simmered, and the loyalty of the various emirs and regional governors, who were expected to squeeze their own people to fund the war, began to waver. Their commitment to the siege was now being weighed against the risk of rebellion and unrest in their home territories. The drain on physical resources was just as severe. The siege was a voracious consumer of specialized materials. Timber for rebuilding trebuchets and shoring up tunnels had to be hauled from forests far from the coast. Quality stone for ammunition was quarried and transported at great expense. Precious metals were minted into coin to pay the troops or traded for supplies from wary neutral states. All the while, the very conflict that demanded these resources was simultaneously choking off the means to acquire them. Normally bustling trade routes that crisscrossed the region were now perilous corridors, vulnerable to banditry and disruption by enemy patrols. The economic lifeblood of the empire, the taxes on trade, the prosperity of merchants, slowed to a trickle, further reducing the revenue available to fund the war. This created a vicious and inescapable cycle. The longer the siege continued, the more money and materials it consumed. The more resources it consumed, the weaker Saladin's economic position became, limiting his ability to launch a decisive final assault or to properly reward his increasingly restless allies. He found himself trapped in a financial stalemate that mirrored the military one. He could not afford to abandon the siege after investing so much, yet continuing it threatened to bankrupt his state. This economic dimension of the conflict reveals a profound and often overlooked truth of warfare, that the most brilliant general is ultimately constrained by the contents of his treasury. Strategy requires not just maps and moving troops, but also ledgers and stable coinage. The dream of military glory found its limit in the harsh reality of depleted coffers and the grumbling of overtaxed subjects, proving that an empire's ability to wage war is only as strong as its economy's ability to support it. Even the most inspiring leader cannot command with absolute authority when his power is built upon a fragile coalition of ambitious men, each with their own priorities and pockets of influence. Saladin's empire was not a modern, monolithic state with a rigid chain of command. It was a recently unified patchwork of territories, each governed by powerful emirs and regional lords who had sworn him allegiance but had not surrendered their own autonomy or self-interest. These were not mere subordinates, they were partners in a grand enterprise, and their continued support was contingent on the promise of glory, spoils, and the enhancement of their own prestige. As the Siege of Acre dragged on with no glorious conclusion in sight, the delicate threads holding this coalition together began to fray, revealing dangerous cracks in the foundation of Saladin's command. The core of the problem was a fundamental misalignment of goals. For Saladin, the capture of Acre was a strategic imperative, the final and necessary step to secure his legacy and eliminate the Crusader threat for a generation. For many of his key commanders, however, the campaign was a costly diversion. Their primary concerns often lay closer to home, protecting their own domains from rival neighbors, managing local rebellions, or simply conserving their personal wealth and military strength. A prince from Mosul or an emir from the Jazeera might view the endless, expensive stalemate outside Acre as a drain on resources that would be better spent consolidating power in his own region. This divergence created a constant, low-grade tension in the command tent. Saladin would argue for patience and a renewed assault, while a powerful ally might advocate for a tactical withdrawal to regroup, or even propose shifting forces to address a perceived threat on the opposite side of the empire. Every war council became a subtle negotiation, a political chess game where the overall strategy was often secondary to placating a dissatisfied ally. These political maneuverings translated directly into military half-measures and frustrating delays on the ground. A contingent promised for a major assault might arrive late or under strength, their commander having decided to hold back his best troops to minimize his own losses. Attacks that required precise timing would fail because a particular emir, feeling his contribution was not being properly recognized or rewarded, would order his men to hang back, refusing to commit fully to the plan. There were even accusations whispered in the chronicles of the time that some leaders, eyeing the potential for a post-Saladin power vacuum, were not entirely unhappy to see the Sultan's prestige and resources being slowly bled white against Acre's walls. This wasn't outright treachery, but a calculated form of self-preservation that severely hampered the war effort. The Crusaders, for their part, were quick to recognize and exploit these divisions. Their spies and scouts would have reported on the separate, fortified camps of the different Muslim leaders, a clear physical manifestation of their lack of unity. They learned to identify the banners of less committed contingents and would focus their sorties and raids on those sectors, knowing the response might be sluggish and uncoordinated. They also engaged in their own form of psychological warfare, sending messages meant to sow further discord, perhaps offering a separate truce to one emir, not to be accepted, but to arouse Saladin's suspicion and deepen the mistrust within his ranks. This ability to turn their enemy's political weakness into a military advantage was a crucial factor in prolonging the defense. It demonstrated that a fortress is not only defended by its walls, but also by the fractures in the army arrayed against it. The Siege of Acre stands as a powerful lesson that the most brilliant strategy conceived by a single mind can be undone by the competing ambitions of many, proving that in the complicated algebra of war, political unity is a coefficient that multiplies every other factor, and without it, even the most formidable force can be reduced to a sum of its disunited parts. Even as his armies strained against the walls of Acre and his resources dwindled, Saladin understood that victory could be achieved through means other than sheer force. He was, after all, a leader celebrated for his chivalry and strategic cunning, and he recognized the potential power of diplomacy to break a costly stalemate. On multiple occasions throughout the grueling 2-year siege, he extended offers for a negotiated settlement, attempting to use the language of truce and surrender to accomplish what his siege engines could not. Yet, each of these diplomatic overtures ultimately failed, not for a lack of trying, but due to a series of critical miscalculations that reveal the complex interplay between perception, pride, and power in the heat of conflict. A central flaw in Saladin's diplomatic approach was a fundamental misreading of his adversary's psychology and their shifting circumstances. Early in the siege, when the defenders were isolated and desperate, he may have held a strong negotiating position. However, his initial offers were often perceived as either overly harsh or insufficiently tempting, failing to provide the defenders with a face-saving way out. He underestimated the potent combination of religious fanaticism and sheer desperation that animated the men trapped inside Acre. For them, surrender was not merely a tactical decision. It was a potential betrayal of their god, their king, and their fellow crusaders. They were holding on against all odds for one reason above all others: the fervent hope of reinforcement. Saladin, confident in his military containment, seems to have discounted just how powerful that hope could be as a motivator. He negotiated from a position of what he believed was overwhelming strength, not fully appreciating that the defenders' knowledge of the approaching Third Crusade gave them a psychological leverage all their own, the leverage of impending salvation. This miscalculation was compounded at later stages. After the arrival of kings like Richard the Lionheart, the balance of power shifted dramatically. The Crusaders were no longer a beleaguered garrison on the verge of collapse. They were a confident, reinforced army brimming with a newfound sense of destiny. In this new context, Saladin's attempts to negotiate were hampered by his own legendary reputation. Having built an image on magnanimity and honor after his victory at Hatton, he may have been unwilling to make the kind of stark, pragmatic concessions that a truly desperate situation now demanded. There are suggestions from contemporary sources that he overvalued his own chivalrous image, expecting it to be reciprocated with equal honor by the Crusader leaders, particularly Richard. Yet Richard was a practical and fiercely ambitious commander, far more interested in decisive military victory than in upholding a shared code of conduct with his Muslim adversary. Saladin's diplomatic language, perhaps tailored for a different kind of opponent, fell on deaf ears. He failed to adapt his offers to the new, more aggressive and confident reality of the Crusader command. The most costly misstep, however, was one of timing and flexibility. Some historians argue that a clear opportunity existed for a negotiated end to the siege before the full might of the Third Crusade had landed. Had Saladin offered truly generous terms, perhaps allowing the garrison to leave with their lives and weapons in exchange for the city, he could have secured Acre and freed his army to meet the arriving European forces on open ground, a scenario that would have hugely favored his mobile style of warfare. But such an offer would have required him to swallow his pride, to accept a symbolic rather than a total victory for the sake of a larger strategic gain. This kind of pragmatic flexibility proved elusive. The very investment of time, lives, and treasure in the siege created a sunk cost fallacy, making it psychologically difficult to offer the concessions necessary for a deal. Each rejected offer hardened positions on both sides, wasting precious months and squandering opportunities that would never come again. In the end, the failure of these negotiations forced the conflict to be resolved by the very thing diplomacy is meant to avoid: a final, bloody, and total military conclusion. The Crusaders, once they broke the siege, showed little of the mercy that Saladin had once extended. The fall of Acre was followed by a brutal aftermath. This stark contrast serves as a timeless lesson in the art of statecraft. It underscores that soft power, the power of persuasion, negotiation, and strategic compromise, is not a sign of weakness, but a sophisticated tool that can preserve resources, secure objectives, and even save lives. The greatest military minds understand that the perfect victory is not always the total victory. Sometimes it is the victory achieved with the least cost. At Acre, Saladin's brilliance on the battlefield was not matched by an equal finesse at the negotiating table, a disconnect that ultimately allowed a stubborn defense to harden into a catastrophic defeat. Yet for all his mastery of the land, Saladin faced a frontier he could not conquer: the endless, shifting blue expanse of the Mediterranean Sea. His campaign against Acre was fundamentally hamstrung by a force he never truly commanded: a navy. This maritime blind spot created an asymmetry in the siege that the Crusaders exploited with ruthless efficiency, turning the water into a highway of salvation that he was powerless to block. While his armies dug trenches and raised earthworks to seal off the landward approaches, the seaward side of the city remained wide open, a yawning gap in the noose he was trying to tighten. Every day, the horizon held the potential for a new fleet of sails, a sight that filled the defenders with hope and the besiegers with a sense of futility. This was the cruel paradox of his position. He could dominate the earth, but he could not control the waves, and that single vulnerability would ultimately prove insurmountable. The lifeline provided by the sea was not a mere trickle of supplies. It was a constant, robust flow that sustained the entire defense. Christian ships, primarily from the formidable maritime republics of Genoa and Pisa, ran the ineffective Muslim naval blockade with near impunity. These were not fragile transports. They were sleek, well-armed war galleys and sturdy round ships, manned by experienced crews who knew these waters intimately. They brought in shiploads of grain, salted meat, and wine to replenish dwindling stores, bundles of fresh arrows and bolts for the crossbows, and heavy timber and rope for repairing the city's battered defenses. But perhaps most importantly, they brought people. They ferried in a steady stream of knights, men-at-arms, and skilled engineers from Europe, replacing the defenders lost to battle and disease. This constant rotation of fresh, high-morale troops was a luxury Saladin could never afford. His army, static and exposed, slowly waned in strength and spirit, while the garrison inside Acre, continually refreshed from the sea, maintained a stubborn, resilient core. The harbor became the city's beating heart, and every ship that slipped safely into port was another transfusion of life, ensuring the body politic of the defense remained strong. This naval supremacy also granted the Crusaders an overwhelming offensive advantage that completely altered the dynamics of the siege. Saladin was forced to deploy his forces in a wide, thin arc around the landward side of the city, a necessary but dangerously extended formation. The Crusaders, from their secure harbor, could choose when and where to strike this long line. Using their ships as mobile platforms, they could launch devastating amphibious assaults at points of their choosing, often where the Muslim forces were weakest or least expected. A fleet of landing craft would suddenly push off from the city's wharves, carrying a concentrated force of armored knights and infantry to hit a vulnerable section of the besieging lines. These were not mere raids, they were full-scale attacks from an unexpected direction, the sea. By the time Saladin could rush reinforcements to the threatened sector, the Crusaders would often have already inflicted significant casualties, destroyed siege engines, and then withdrawn back to the safety of their ships and the city walls. This ability to project power from the sea kept his entire army permanently off balance and on the defensive, forcing him to divert thousands of men from the primary task of assaulting Acre to the passive, draining duty of guarding miles of coastline against a threat that could materialize anywhere at any time. Saladin's attempts to contest this naval dominance were fragmented and ultimately ineffective. He lacked a centralized, professional navy of his own. His naval efforts relied on a patchwork of ships from his Egyptian domains and those provided by reluctant allies, a fleet that was neither large enough nor coordinated enough to challenge the experienced European sailors. His captains were outmaneuvered and outfought in the few direct naval engagements that occurred. He attempted to build a boom across the harbor entrance, a chain of floating logs meant to block incoming ships, but the Crusaders, likely with the help of their Italian marine allies, managed to break or bypass it. He even resorted to the desperate measure of using fireships, old vessels set ablaze and sent drifting toward the Christian fleet, but these were easily towed aside by alert sailors in fast skiffs. Each failed attempt to interrupt the sea lane was a demoralizing blow, a stark advertisement of his powerlessness over this critical domain. It highlighted a strategic lesson that echoes through military history, from ancient Rome to the modern day. Victory often belongs to the power that can control the commons, whether they be seas, skies, or cyberspace. To dominate the land while ceding the sea is to fight with one arm tied behind your back, forever reacting to an enemy who holds the initiative and enjoys the freedom of movement that you are denied. Trapped within the stone embrace of their city, the defenders of Acre faced a grim reality. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and under constant assault by one of history's most brilliant commanders. Yet their response was not one of passive despair. Instead of merely enduring the storm, they became architects of their own salvation, transforming the entire city into a dynamic, living engine of resistance. This was not a static defense. It was an active, breathing entity that learned, adapted, and struck back with a creativity born of absolute necessity. Where Saladin's strategies were broad and sweeping, the Crusaders' innovations were intimate and immediate, a testament to human ingenuity flourishing under the most extreme pressure. One of the most critical challenges was the relentless bombardment from Saladin's massive trebuchets. Rather than simply watching their walls crumble, the defenders became masters of rapid, inventive repair. They didn't just pile stones back into the gaps, they learned to build smarter. When a section of wall was breached, they would often construct a secondary inner wall directly behind it, a makeshift but sturdy barrier that would catch any attackers who managed to scramble through the initial hole, funneling them into a deadly killing zone. They used any material they could find: shattered masonry, beams from demolished houses, even packed earth and rubble, to create these internal defenses. This layered approach meant that breaching the outer wall was no longer a guaranteed path to victory. it often became a trap for the attackers, turning Saladin's engineering successes into costly failures. Their innovation extended far beyond construction. The defenders became adept at crafting makeshift weapons and repurposing everyday items for war. Lacking the seemingly endless supply of stone ammunition available to the besiegers, they got creative. They gathered the rounded sea stones that littered the beaches and launched them from their own, smaller catapults. When suitable rocks grew scarce, they filled clay pots with Greek fire and hurled them into the Muslim siege lines, creating terrifying incendiary bombs that could set wooden towers and artillery alight. Even the city's blacksmiths and metalworkers were mobilized not just to repair armor and swords, but to forge new, specialized weapons like caltrops, four-pointed metal spikes that were scattered on the ground outside sally ports to lame the horses of the Muslim cavalry, disrupting potential counterattacks before they could even begin. But perhaps the most psychologically potent weapon in their arsenal was the surprise sortie. These were not reckless, chaotic charges. They were carefully planned, lightning-fast operations designed to inflict maximum damage with minimal risk. Under the cover of darkness or a dense morning fog, a small, elite force of knights and sergeants would silently slip out of a carefully concealed postern gate. Their targets were precise. They aimed to destroy the painstakingly assembled siege engines, set fire to the sprawling encampments, and assassinate key engineers or officers. The goal was not to break the siege in one grand gesture, but to constantly harass, to keep the besiegers perpetually off balance and sleep-deprived. The psychological impact of these raids was immense. For Saladin's army, it meant that even the relative safety of their own camp was an illusion. They could never truly rest, forever glancing over their shoulder, dreading the sudden shout of alarm and the sight of armored figures emerging from the gloom. This relentless pressure turned the tables, making the besiegers feel like the ones under a form of siege, their confidence slowly eroding with each successful Crusader raid. This culture of adaptability was a collective effort, a fusion of different skills and backgrounds. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, provided the disciplined, hardened core of warriors. The Italian mariners from Genoa and Pisa, masters of navigation and maritime combat, ensured the lifeblood of supplies kept flowing and helped plan amphibious counterattacks along the coast. Even the ordinary citizens played their part, acting as lookouts, firefighters, and laborers for the constant repair work. This shared purpose and the cross-pollination of ideas from different cultures created a hotbed of innovation. A sailor's knowledge of ropes and pulleys might be adapted to create a new counterweight system for a defensive catapult. A stonemason's understanding of stress points would inform how a breach was shored up. The defense of Acre became a collaborative, evolving project, a stark contrast to the sometimes fractious and disconnected command structure in Saladin's camp. Their ingenuity under fire stands as a powerful lesson that a determined defense is not about waiting for rescue, but about actively shaping the battle on your own terms, using every tool, every idea, and every ounce of courage to force your enemy to fight the battle you want them to fight, not the one they had planned. Beyond the clash of steel and the roar of siege engines, the struggle for Acre was fueled by a deeper, more intangible force, the profound and often unyielding power of faith and culture. For both the Crusader and the Muslim warrior, this was far more than a simple territorial dispute. It was a holy war, a cosmic struggle between the cross and the crescent, where earthly victory was intertwined with divine favor and eternal salvation. This religious fervor provided the immense motivational energy that kept men fighting through unimaginable hardship, but it also cast a long shadow, creating strategic blind spots and hardening hearts against the pragmatic compromises that might have ended the conflict sooner. Saladin, the great unifier of the Muslim world, wielded his faith as a powerful political tool. His call for jihad had been the glue that bonded together the often feuding emirs and princes of Syria and Egypt. His image was not just that of a conqueror, but of a pious and chivalrous leader, a champion of Islam. This carefully crafted persona was a source of immense strength, but it also came with its own set of constraints. Certain actions, however tactically sound, risked shattering that image and alienating the very allies he depended on. A ruthless massacre of prisoners or the wanton destruction of sacred sites within Acre might have broken the defender's spirit more quickly, but such acts would have been utterly at odds with the reputation for mercy and honor he had cultivated after his victory at Hatton. He was caught in a delicate balancing act, forced to weigh military necessity against the political and religious expectations of his coalition. This sometimes led to hesitant or half-measured responses at critical moments, as the need to present a unified front and maintain his standing as a righteous leader could override the cold, pragmatic calculus of war. On the other side of the walls, the Crusader defenders were equally bound by a potent and often blinding religious zeal. They were not just soldiers, they were pilgrims and penitents, fighting for the redemption of their souls and the liberation of the Holy Land. This mindset made them incredibly resilient. They were willing to endure starvation, disease, and constant bombardment for a cause they believed was ordained by God Himself. However, this same fervor made them notoriously unwilling to compromise. To surrender Acre, even on terms that might have saved their lives, could be seen as a betrayal of their sacred oath and a failure in their divine mission. Their resolve was hardened by the clergy within the city, who framed their suffering as a test of faith and any talk of negotiation as a temptation from the devil. This absolute commitment to total victory, or martyrdom in its pursuit, closed off potential diplomatic avenues and ensured the fight would be a bloody, all-or-nothing struggle to the very end. This collision of deeply held beliefs often led both sides to prioritize symbolic victories over tangible, pragmatic gains. For Saladin, capturing a particular banner or a revered fragment of the true cross held in the city might have been seen as a greater achievement than securing a key tactical position, because of the immense psychological and religious blow it would deal to the enemy. Similarly, for the Crusaders, a successful sortie to burn a single Muslim banner flying near the walls was celebrated as a major triumph, a sign of God's favor, even if it had little impact on the overall military situation. These symbolic acts were powerful motivators, but they could also distract from the grinding, unglamorous work of logistics and engineering that ultimately decided the fate of the siege. The battle for Acre thus operated on two parallel levels: the physical struggle for the city and the metaphysical struggle for divine endorsement, where a perceived sign from heaven could sometimes hold more sway than the stark reality of a dwindling food supply or a breached wall. Understanding this cultural and religious lens is essential to explaining the seemingly irrational decisions that characterized the long stalemate. It was a war where the heart and the soul often commanded the hand, and where the ultimate victory was measured not just in territory taken, but in faith affirmed. The brutal, grinding nature of the siege can be best understood not as a single, continuous event, but as a series of intense, violent pulses, specific battles and assaults where the grand strategies of both sides collided in a chaotic and often unpredictable melee. One of the most telling of these engagements was the relentless fighting around the Accursed Tower, a formidable bastion that anchored the city's northern defenses. For Saladin's forces, capturing this tower was the key to breaching the inner wall and pouring into the city streets. His engineers had painstakingly built massive siege towers of their own, rolling these wooden giants, draped in water-soaked hides to resist fire right up to the battlements. The plan was sound, a classic application of siegecraft, yet the defenders, a mix of desperate knights and determined Italian mariners, refused to yield the critical point. They met this technological threat with a horrifying mix of ingenuity and brutality. Instead of just hurling rocks, they launched pots filled with a sticky, volatile substance, the infamous Greek fire, that clung to the wooden siege engines and burned with an inextinguishable fury, even on water. The air filled with the screams of men and the acrid smell of smoke and charred flesh as these towering symbols of Muslim engineering prowess were reduced to ash. This was more than a defensive victory. It was a profound psychological blow. It demonstrated that for all of Saladin's preparation, the defenders held a terrifying capacity for destructive innovation, turning his own technological advantage against him in a spectacular and demoralizing fashion. Another critical moment that encapsulates the fog of war occurred during a major Muslim assault on a newly created breach in the outer wall. Saladin's troops, after weeks of mining and bombardment, had finally collapsed a significant section of the fortifications. Seeing their opportunity, a large force of his best troops, including his personal guard, surged forward into the gap, expecting to find a panicked and broken enemy. Instead, they found themselves channeled into a deadly trap. The Crusaders, anticipating exactly this move, had not been idle during the breach. They had used the rubble to construct a crude but effective secondary wall just inside the opening, creating a killing zone. As the Muslim soldiers funneled through the narrow breach, they were met with a concentrated storm of crossbow bolts, spears, and stones from defenders positioned on this inner barrier and on the intact walls to either side. The assault, which had moments before seemed on the verge of triumph, degenerated into a bloody, chaotic slaughter. The mistake was a classic one, a failure of reconnaissance and a misreading of the enemy's resilience. The attackers had seen the breach as an end in itself, while the defenders saw it merely as a new element of the battlefield to be manipulated. This micro-event shows how a perfectly reasonable tactical decision exploiting a breach could snowball into a catastrophic setback due to an inability to see the immediate, adaptive countermove of a resourceful enemy. Perhaps the most famous engagement linked to the larger Acre campaign was the Battle of Arsuf, fought in September of 1191, as Richard the Lionheart marched his Crusader army south from the city. While not a direct assault on the siege lines, Arsuf was a direct consequence of the stalemate and a brilliant demonstration of how Saladin's tactical playbook could be countered by disciplined leadership. Saladin, seeking to destroy the Crusader relief army before it could link up with other forces, harassed Richard's marching column for days, using his favored tactic of feigned retreats and constant arrow storms from his horse archers. His goal was to provoke the Crusader knights into a disorganized, premature charge, breaking their tight defensive formation and allowing his cavalry to pick them apart, a strategy that had worked to perfection at Hatton. But Richard, a master of discipline and timing, held his men in an almost superhuman state of control. He understood the temptation and the trap. For hours, his infantry and knights endured the galling missile fire, maintaining their shield wall and marching order. The pressure was immense, and at one point, 2 knights from the rearguard finally broke, launching themselves in a furious charge. This was the moment Saladin had been waiting for, the potential unraveling of the entire army. Yet Richard's genius shone through in his adaptability. Instead of letting the charge dissolve into a disastrous, piecemeal effort, he instantly recognized the point of no return and transformed a potential catastrophe into a coordinated general charge. The entire Crusader line erupted forward in a devastatingly synchronized shock assault that caught the Muslim army by surprise. Believing the feint had worked, and routed them from the field. Arsuf was a masterpiece of turntables, where Saladin's own preferred tactic was used as the bait for a devastating counterpunch. It proved that his tactical brilliance was not infallible. It could be studied, anticipated, and turned against him by a commander of equal caliber and an army with iron discipline. These individual clashes, from the fiery defense of the Accursed Tower to the disciplined fury of Arsuf, were the violent heartbeats of the long siege, each one a story of plans meeting the harsh, unyielding reality of a determined foe. While the immediate aftermath of the siege saw a temporary Crusader victory, the long-term consequences of that grueling 2-year stalemate unfolded like a slow-acting poison, seeping into the foundations of Saladin's empire and altering the destiny of the entire region. The most direct and damaging impact was the catastrophic drain on his resources. The campaign had consumed an enormous portion of the treasury he had spent years building, depleting the financial reserves needed to pay his armies, maintain his network of alliances, and govern his vast territories effectively. This economic exhaustion forced him into a position of weakness in the years that followed, limiting his ability to fund major new campaigns or even properly rebuild the forces shattered at Acre. The once flush coffers of the Sultanate were now alarmingly bare, and the constant need to levy taxes to refill them began to erode the loyalty of the very people whose support he relied upon. Beyond the empty treasury, the stalemate inflicted a wound that was perhaps even more dangerous, a significant blow to Saladin's aura of invincibility. For years, he had been the undefeated champion of Islam, a figure who seemed to command fortune itself. The failure to take Acre, despite his overwhelming numerical advantage and his commitment of vast resources, shattered that image. To the various emirs and princes within his coalition, it was a signal that his power was not absolute and that his strategic judgment could be flawed. This erosion of prestige made it increasingly difficult to command the absolute obedience of his sometimes reluctant allies. They had joined his cause for glory and victory, and the protracted, costly failure at Acre provided neither. The political cohesion that was the bedrock of his power began to show subtle but critical cracks as regional leaders started to question his authority and prioritize their own local interests over the grand unified jihad. This weakening of Saladin's position stood in stark contrast to the momentum it handed the Crusaders. The successful defense of Acre, culminating in its capture, was nothing less than a massive psychological victory for Europe. It proved that Saladin could be beaten. It demonstrated that even his greatest efforts could be thwarted by determined resistance and sea power. This emboldened the rulers of Europe to commit even more resources to the Third Crusade, transforming it from a desperate rescue mission into a confident campaign of reconquest. The time bought by the long siege was invaluable. It allowed for the meticulous planning and gathering of the immense forces that would be led by Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus. Acre was no longer a city under threat. It became the unshakable beachhead, the secure base of operations from which the Crusaders could launch their methodical campaign down the coast towards the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. The ripple effects of this shift in momentum would define the next chapter of the Crusades. The campaigns that followed, including Richard's famous march and the Battle of Arsuf, were made possible by the secure logistical tail that now ran through Acre's harbor. The city became the heart of the rump Crusader state, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, for another century, ensuring a continued European presence in the Holy Land long after the other gains of the Third Crusade had been lost. Saladin, though still a formidable opponent, was never again able to regain the overwhelming strategic initiative he had enjoyed before the siege. He was forced onto the defensive, fighting to preserve his gains rather than expanding them. The stalemate at Acre, therefore, was not an endpoint but a critical hinge moment in history. It sapped the strength of the Muslim resurgence and breathed new life into the Crusader cause, setting the stage for a complex and bloody struggle that would continue for generations, all because one city refused to fall and, in doing so, changed the balance of power in the medieval world. The grand drama of the siege, with its heroic charges and thunderous siege engines, often captures our imagination, but the true, grinding reality of the conflict was decided not on the ramparts, but in the dust-choked supply lines stretching hundreds of miles into the hinterlands. Acre stands as one of history's most profound object lessons in a simple, brutal truth. An army marches on its stomach, and even the most brilliant strategy will starve to death without a bulletproof plan for logistics. Saladin's campaign is a masterclass in what happens when operational ambition fatally outstrips logistical capability, a cautionary tale that modern military academies still dissect to this day. Consider the sheer scale of the problem he faced. We're not talking about supplying a few thousand men for a week-long campaign. This was a vast force, tens of thousands strong, along with all their horses, camels, and camp followers, committed to a static position for an indefinite period. The daily consumption was staggering: mountains of grain, forests of firewood, and lakes of fresh water, all devoured in a relentless cycle of need. His supply chain was a fragile, sprawling organism, a network of camel caravans and ox carts snaking its way from Damascus, from Egypt, and from the farms of Syria. Every mile that separated his camp from these sources was a mile of vulnerability. A convoy wasn't just delayed by bad weather. It could be ambushed by Christian patrols from the still defiant city of Tyre, waylaid by bandits, or simply lost to the unforgiving terrain. A single washed-out bridge in a mountain pass could mean that an entire week's ration of grain would never arrive, triggering a cascade of hunger and discontent through the ranks. This wasn't a temporary inconvenience, it was a structural weakness in his entire operational design. This logistical nightmare created a devastating asymmetry between the besieger and the besieged. Inside Acre, the defenders, though under constant pressure, enjoyed the supreme luxury of strategic depth via the Mediterranean Sea. Their supply line was a maritime highway, fast, efficient, and largely secure from Saladin's land-based forces. A ship from Cyprus could bring 100 tons of grain directly to the city's docks in a matter of days, a journey that would take a land convoy weeks and consume a significant portion of its cargo just to feed the drivers and animals along the way. They could import not just food, but specialized personnel, master engineers from Italy, skilled carpenters, and batches of expensive, standardized crossbow bolts manufactured in Sicilian workshops. Saladin's army, by contrast, was slowly consuming itself. Every arrow fired was one that had to be replaced by a long, perilous overland journey. The once formidable siege engines fell silent for lack of suitable stone, which had to be quarried, shaped, and transported from distant sites. The campaign devolved from a war of movement into a dismal war of economic and industrial attrition, where the side with the most robust and resilient supply system held an unbeatable advantage. The most crippling failure, however, was in health management and sanitation, a facet of logistics often overlooked in tales of glory. The Muslim encampment became a petri dish of disease. Tens of thousands of men and animals packed together in a confined space with primitive sanitation created the perfect conditions for disaster. Latrine pits overflowed, contaminating the local water sources. Flies swarmed from waste piles to food stores, spreading typhoid and dysentery. These camp fevers were far deadlier than any Crusader sword. A soldier weakened by dysentery was a soldier who couldn't fight, who consumed scarce medical resources, and whose plight eroded the morale of those around him. The defenders within their stone city had better access to clean wells and cisterns, and while disease struck them too, they were better sheltered and could manage their sanitation more effectively. Saladin was losing his army not to enemy knights but to invisible pathogens, a grim reminder that a general must be a master of public health as much as a master of tactics. The modern lesson from this medieval misery is crystal clear. From the beaches of Normandy to the deserts of Iraq, the principle holds true. Logistics is the bridge between tactical genius and strategic success. Saladin's oversight at Acre teaches the danger of overextension, of launching a campaign without first securing your lines of communication and establishing a resilient, redundant system for sustainment. It underscores the need for a robust support system that can adapt to setbacks, whether they be ambushed convoys, broken bridges, or outbreaks of disease. A modern military planner studying Acre learns that you must fuel the fight, you must feed the fighter, and you must care for the wounded, because without that unwavering foundation of support, the most elegant battle plan in the world is nothing more than a fantasy written on parchment, destined to crumble to dust. Yet beyond the ledger books of resource depletion and the grand strategy of kings, there existed a far more intimate and corrosive enemy slowly eating away at the heart of Saladin's army, the profound, grinding fatigue of the human spirit. A siege is not merely a military operation, it is a profound psychological trial, a test of endurance that measures the limits of hope and the strength of a soldier's connection to the cause. For months that bled into years, the men who had once charged forward with cries of victory found themselves mired in a stagnant, miserable existence. The dazzling dream of conquest and glory that had drawn them to Acre's walls gradually faded, replaced by the dreary, unchanging reality of life in the siege lines, the interminable boredom punctuated by bursts of terror, the poor food, the cramped and filthy conditions, and the ever-present stench of death and decay. This was not the war they had signed up for. The initial religious fervor and loyalty to Saladin, while potent forces, were not infinite resources. They were slowly being spent like a candle burning at both ends, with no fresh reserves to draw upon. This spiritual exhaustion manifested in dangerously practical ways. The iron discipline that is the backbone of any effective army began to soften and warp. Sentries, exhausted from nights of interrupted sleep and constant alert for Crusader sorties, might doze at their posts or fail to notice the subtle signs of an impending attack. Orders from unit commanders, once obeyed instantly and without question, were now met with sullen reluctance or muttered complaints. The professional soldiers and volunteers who formed the core of the force began to view their emirs and officers with a new, cynical eye, seeing them not as inspired leaders but as distant figures who enjoyed better rations and safer quarters. This erosion of trust and discipline created a brittle army, one that might hold together under normal circumstances but was dangerously vulnerable to shock or sudden reversal. The unbreakable instrument Saladin had wielded at Hatton was becoming fragile, its cohesion threatened not by the enemy outside but by the despair within. The most telling symptom of this deep malaise was the quiet, shameful act of desertion. Under the cover of darkness, men would make their choice. Sometimes it was a solitary figure, a foot soldier from Anatolia who simply could not bear another day of the flies and the fear, slipping past the picket lines with nothing but a waterskin and a desperate hope to find the road back home. Other times it was small groups of men from the same village who had promised each other's families they would look out for one another, deciding that their duty to the living outweighed their oath to a sultan and a cause that seemed increasingly abstract. These desertions were rarely in large, dramatic numbers. A mass exodus would have been quickly spotted and stopped. Instead, it was a slow, constant trickle, a silent bleeding of manpower that was almost more damaging because of its insidious nature. Each morning, commanders would discover a few more men missing, a few more gaps in the line. The message this sent to those who remained was corrosive. Their comrades had voted with their feet, deciding that survival was more important than victory. It seeded a dangerous thought in every man's mind. If they can leave, why can't I? This human factor presented a command problem that Saladin's military genius was poorly equipped to solve. He could inspire men to charge a breach, he could outmaneuver an enemy on the field, but how does a commander combat homesickness? How does he resupply an army's depleted store of hope? His attempts to boost morale promises of future reward, reminders of their sacred duty, rang increasingly hollow to men shivering in the rain or burying another friend claimed by disease. The defenders of Acre, though physically confined, held a powerful psychological advantage. Every ship that sailed unmolested into their harbor was a visual testament to their connection to the wider world, a delivery of hope that they were not forgotten. For Saladin's troops, staring at the same battered walls day after day, the world had shrunk to this miserable patch of ground. Their horizon was limited by trench lines and enemy banners, a constant reminder of their trapped and stagnant state. The Siege of Acre, in its final stages, became less a battle of weapons and more a battle of wills, demonstrating the timeless truth that the strongest fortress is a resilient spirit, and the most vulnerable point in any army's line is the breaking point of the human heart. The frustration Saladin endured outside the walls of Acre was not a unique curse of his command, but rather a timeless feature of siege warfare itself, a brutal, grinding form of conflict that has tested the limits of armies and empires across millennia. To truly grasp the scale of his challenge, we can place Acre alongside other legendary sieges, drawing parallels that reveal universal truths about these protracted ordeals, while also highlighting the specific combination of factors that made his failure so poignant. Consider the epic siege of Constantinople in 1453, where the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II finally breached the legendary Theodosian walls. Like Saladin, Mehmed faced a seemingly impregnable defensive position, and his victory was ultimately secured not by overwhelming numbers, but by a terrifying technological leap, the massive bronze cannon of the Hungarian engineer Orban, a weapon so enormous it could fire stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, capable of reducing ancient stonework to rubble. This mirrors the technological arms race at Acre, where both sides constantly innovated with trebuchets, Greek fire, and countermining. The key difference, however, lies in the outcome. Mehmed's investment in cutting-edge technology paid off, creating a decisive breach. Saladin, despite his own engineering efforts, found his technological advantages consistently neutralized by the defenders' rapid adaptations and their ability to import new ideas and materials by sea. Where Mehmed successfully used a new weapon to break a stalemate, Saladin found himself trapped in an endless cycle of innovation and counter-innovation that drained his resources without yielding a breakthrough. Another powerful parallel can be drawn from the much earlier siege of Masada, where a band of Jewish zealots held out against the relentless Roman 10th Legion atop a desert fortress. The common thread here is the immense psychological power of a desperate defense. The zealots, like the Crusaders in Acre, were fueled by a cause they believed was worth dying for, making them incredibly resilient against a far superior force. The Romans, much like Saladin, were forced to undertake a monumental logistical undertaking, building a massive siege ramp up the side of the mountain, a project that took months and consumed vast resources. The Romans, however, possessed an absolute advantage in control. They surrounded Masada completely, cutting off any hope of relief or resupply. This is the critical factor that eluded Saladin. His siege was never truly complete. The sea remained an open highway for his enemy, a constant reminder to his own troops of their inability to fully isolate their prey. The defenders of Masada were truly alone. The defenders of Acre never were. This fundamental difference in the ability to impose total isolation is what separates our ultimately successful, if costly, Roman siege from Saladin's failed one. Even a comparison to a much more modern siege, like the German attack on Stalingrad during the Second World War, reveals enduring themes. The battle for the city devolved into a brutal, close-quarters struggle for every ruin, much like the fighting around the breaches and sally ports of Acre. In both cases, the attacking force became bogged down in urban terrain that neutralized their advantages in maneuver and firepower. Both the German Wehrmacht and Saladin's army also faced catastrophic logistical failures. The German supply lines across the frozen steppe were vulnerable and inadequate, leading to starvation and a lack of ammunition in the depths of the Russian winter. Saladin's overland supply caravans were similarly vulnerable to disruption and the elements. In both cases, the attacking army was slowly bled white, not primarily by enemy action, but by the administrative failure to sustain them in a protracted struggle. The lesson is clear across centuries. An army that cannot be fed, supplied, and kept healthy will eventually break, regardless of the courage of its soldiers or the brilliance of its initial plan. What ultimately makes the Siege of Acre stand apart, however, is its role as a dramatic reversal of fortune for a commander at the peak of his power. Many famous sieges, like that of Troy or Jerusalem, represent the culmination of a long campaign, the final act in a story of conquest. Acre was different. For Saladin, it was meant to be the triumphant final chapter, the mopping-up operation after his great victory at Hatton. Instead, it became a quagmire that stalled his momentum and allowed his enemies to regroup and counterattack. Unlike Mehmed at Constantinople, he could not leverage a single technological marvel to win the day. Unlike the Romans at Masada, he could not achieve total encirclement. And unlike many sieges that end with the fall of the city, Acre's defense was successful enough to fundamentally alter the strategic balance of an entire war. It was not a grand finale, but an intermission that gave the Crusaders a second act. By examining it through the lens of other great sieges, we see that Saladin's struggle was not a bizarre historical anomaly, but a classic example of a siege gone wrong, where the universal challenges of logistics, technology, and morale combined with a unique geographical and naval disadvantage to create a perfect storm of military frustration. It shows that the same obstacles that have defeated besiegers throughout history, from ancient Rome to modern times, can humble even the most celebrated generals, proving that no amount of tactical genius can overcome a fundamentally unsustainable strategic position. History has a curious way of sanding down the rough edges of a story, transforming complex human beings into smooth, polished legends, and few figures have been burnished to a brighter shine than Saladin. In the centuries following his death, the Kurdish sultan who failed to take Acre was gradually transformed into the very model of a chivalrous and noble adversary, a paragon of military virtue and mercy. This romanticized image, popularized in both Eastern and Western literature, often airbrushes out the frustrating stalemates and strategic missteps, presenting instead a flawless hero whose very nobility explained his magnanimity. The reality, as we've seen, was far more complex and human. The commander at Acre was not an invincible demigod, but a brilliant yet fallible leader grappling with logistical nightmares, political infighting, and an enemy that simply refused to break. The legend favors the sweeping gesture after victory at Hatton. it tends to skip over the 2 years of grinding frustration before the walls of a stubborn port city. This transformation of Saladin's story wasn't an accident. It was driven by powerful cultural and political needs on all sides. In the West, European writers and poets, grappling with their own defeat, found it more palatable to have been beaten by a noble, honorable king than by a mere mortal. It salvaged their own pride. To be conquered by a devilish infidel would have been a spiritual catastrophe, but to be bested by a virtuous pagan, a knightly ideal from an unexpected quarter, allowed them to frame the Crusades as a grand clash of worthy opponents rather than a bloody colonial struggle. His legendary offer of iced water to King Guy, his protection of Christian holy sites in Jerusalem, these acts were amplified and celebrated, creating a narrative of a civilized and merciful conqueror. This image was so potent that even during the Renaissance, he was depicted in art as a worthy foe, and by the Enlightenment, philosophers like Voltaire held him up as a model of tolerance in contrast to the fanaticism of the Crusaders. In the Muslim world, the process was similar but served a different purpose. As the centuries passed and new threats emerged, particularly during periods of fragmentation and external pressure, Saladin was resurrected as a potent symbol of unity and resistance. He became the great unifier, the champion who rallied the Muslim world against foreign invaders. His setbacks, like the long and costly failure at Acre, were minimized in the historical record because they didn't serve this inspiring narrative. The focus remained squarely on his ultimate triumphs, the unification of Syria and Egypt and the recapture of Jerusalem. Leaders from various eras seeking to galvanize their people would invoke his name, painting themselves as his successors. In the modern era, figures as diverse as Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and Saddam Hussein in Iraq have consciously styled themselves as the new Saladin, using his mythologized image to bolster their own legitimacy and call for pan-Arab solidarity. The actual, complicated man, the one who struggled with stubborn emirs and supply shortages, was far less useful for this purpose than the flawless icon. This process invites us to step back and think critically about how history itself is crafted. What we accept as the past is rarely a simple recording of events. It is often a story that has been edited, emphasizing some facts and discarding others, to serve the needs of those who tell it and those who hear it. We remember Saladin not necessarily for what he truly was, but for what we need him to represent. The West needed a noble adversary to preserve its own self-image of chivalry. The East needed a unifying hero to inspire resistance against new challenges. In both cases, the messy, inconvenient truth of a prolonged military failure was smoothed over to create a more powerful and useful symbol. This isn't a matter of deception, but rather of emphasis. We gravitate towards narratives that affirm our values, our identities, and our hopes for the future. The real Saladin, the master strategist who was also capable of significant miscalculation, gets overshadowed by the ideal, the man who embodies the virtues each culture wishes to see in itself and its leaders. His legacy, therefore, is a powerful reminder that history is not just about what happened, but about what we choose to remember and why. The story of Acre is not just a dusty relic from a forgotten age. It is a vibrant and urgent playbook for anyone navigating the complex challenges of the modern world, especially in the high-stakes arenas of business and strategy. Saladin's failure, when stripped of its medieval context, reveals a series of timeless strategic pitfalls that can ensnare even the most brilliant modern CEO or project manager. His campaign serves as a powerful case study in how a superior initial position can be frittered away through a failure to anticipate, adapt, and maintain operational flexibility. Perhaps the most glaring lesson is the absolute necessity of contingency planning. Saladin embarked on his siege with a plan for a swift victory, a plan that was entirely reasonable based on his past successes. But he lacked a robust plan B for a protracted struggle. He failed to ask the critical what-if questions. What if the enemy reinforces by sea? What if our supply lines are cut? What if a new competitor enters the market? In the corporate world, this is the equivalent of a startup burning through its venture capital on an aggressive marketing blitz, assuming rapid user acquisition, without a financial runway to pivot if customers don't materialize as quickly as projected. It's the story of Blockbuster, which had a dominant market position but no contingency for the digital streaming model Netflix pioneered. A modern strategist must map out multiple scenarios, not just the most optimistic one, and have resources and responses prepared for each. This isn't about pessimism, it's about building resilience into the very DNA of a plan. This leads directly to the second critical mistake: the danger of overcommitment and the sunk cost fallacy. Saladin invested so much time, money, prestige, and lives into the siege that walking away became psychologically and politically impossible. Every month that passed only deepened his investment, locking him into a failing strategy. We see this all the time in business. A company pours millions into developing a new product. Early market testing is negative, but instead of cutting their losses, executives reason that they've already spent so much they have to see it through. They double down, investing more good money after bad, hoping to recoup the initial outlay, ultimately leading to an even greater failure. This emotional attachment to a failing project is a dangerous trap. The ability to dispassionately assess a situation, recognize when a strategy is no longer working, and have the courage to pivot or withdraw is a hallmark of great leadership. It's the wisdom to know that the money and time already spent are gone, and the only question that matters is what the most profitable course of action is from this moment forward. Finally, Acre teaches the non-negotiable importance of adaptability. Saladin was a master of tactical adaptation on the open battlefield, but he struggled to adapt his entire operational model to the unique challenge of a static siege against a sea-powered opponent. His organization became rigid. The modern parallel is a company that dominates with a particular business model but fails to innovate when technology or consumer behavior changes. Think of Kodak, which invented the digital camera but clung to its film-based revenue model until it was too late. True adaptability isn't just about tweaking a product, it's about being willing to fundamentally reinvent your entire supply chain, your distribution channels, and even your core identity in response to new threats and opportunities. It requires a culture that encourages experimentation, tolerates smart failures, and empowers employees at all levels to identify and respond to change quickly. The Crusaders inside Acre were the ultimate agile innovators, constantly prototyping new defenses and launching minimum viable products in the form of devastating sorties. Their entire existence was a masterclass in iterative development under pressure. In today's volatile market, that same relentless, creative adaptability is what separates the ventures that thrive from those that end up as a footnote in history, wondering what went wrong despite their early genius. What happened outside the walls of Acre over 8 centuries ago might seem like a distant echo from a forgotten world, a dramatic but irrelevant tale of knights and sultans. Yet the lessons from that grueling stalemate are not locked in the past. They are a living blueprint for understanding the recurring patterns of human conflict and ambition that continue to shape our headlines today. This was more than a medieval battle. It was a profound case study in the anatomy of a quagmire, a scenario that has replayed itself in stunningly familiar ways throughout modern history. The siege teaches us that the seeds of failure are often sown not by a single catastrophic error, but by a cascade of smaller, interconnected miscalculations. A lesson that resonates from the boardrooms of multinational corporations to the situation rooms of world powers. Consider the parallels with more recent conflicts. The protracted struggle for Acre finds a chilling reflection in the Soviet experience in Afghanistan during the 1980s or the American involvement in Vietnam. In each case, a vastly superior military power, confident in its technology and strategy, embarked on what was expected to be a swift campaign. And in each case, that power became entangled in a draining war of attrition against a determined, adaptable enemy. Like Saladin, these modern powers initially focused on conventional military dominance, underestimating the crippling importance of logistics, local politics, and the intangible power of a defender's will. They controlled the cities and the main roads, much like Saladin controlled the land around Acre, but they could never fully control the rugged terrain or the allegiances of the people, just as Saladin could never control the sea. The same logistical nightmares that plagued the Muslim camp vulnerable supply lines, the staggering cost of maintaining a large army in the field, and the erosion of morale over time became the undoing of these modern campaigns. The story of Acre is a timeless warning against the hubris of overconfidence and the perils of underestimating an opponent's resilience. Beyond the battlefield, the principles at play during the siege offer powerful insights for leaders in any field. A modern CEO launching a hostile takeover of a competitor is engaging in a form of economic siege warfare. They might have a brilliant strategy and overwhelming resources, but if they fail to account for the target company's culture, the potential for a poison pill defense, or the arrival of a white knight investor, a direct parallel to the Crusader reinforcements arriving by sea, their ambitious campaign can falter. The same goes for project management. A team might pour immense resources into developing a new product, only to find themselves in a protracted development cycle, their initial momentum stalling as bugs are found and competitors adapt. This is the technological stalemate of Acre in a modern guise. The lesson is to build flexibility and robust contingency planning into the core of any strategy, to always respect the possibility of the unforeseen, and to remember that an opponent or a market is not a static entity but a living, reacting system that will innovate and adapt in response to pressure. Ultimately, the siege's most enduring relevance lies in its profound commentary on human nature itself. It is a story about the limits of power, a reminder that there is a point beyond which more money, more men, and more force yield diminishing returns. Saladin's genius could not overcome the fundamental constraints of geography, logistics, and human endurance. This is a humbling truth for any leader in any era. It argues for a kind of strategic humility, an awareness that no plan survives first contact with reality entirely intact, and that the wisest commanders are those who build in the capacity to listen, to learn, and to pivot. Acre is a monument to perseverance, yes, but also to the folly of doubling down on a failing strategy simply because too much has already been invested. It asks us to consider the delicate balance between ambition and overreach, between confidence and arrogance. In a world that often celebrates disruptive, all-or-nothing gambits, the long, frustrating defense of Acre stands as a testament to the quiet power of resilience, the strategic advantage of a secure supply line, and the undeniable fact that the most brilliant visions can be undone by the simplest, most mundane realities. It is a story that continues to matter because it is, at its heart, a deeply human story, one we seem destined to repeat, and from which we must continually strive to learn. The Siege of Acre stands as a profound and enduring testament to a simple, humbling truth. that even the most brilliant minds armed with the best-laid plans can be brought to a standstill by the relentless friction of reality. Saladin's undeniable genius, the very same that had rewritten the rules of warfare at Hatton, simply wasn't enough to overcome the perfect storm of logistical nightmares, the arrival of unpredictable reinforcements, and the simple, grinding fallibility of human nature. His story is not one of a sudden, catastrophic blunder, but of a slow, inexorable erosion, a masterplan gradually undone by 1,000 small cuts. We see the limits of pure strategy when it crashes against the unyielding rocks of supply lines stretched to breaking point, of alliances frayed by ambition, and of morale sapped by the endless, draining passage of time. This epic 2-year struggle offers us more than just a tale from a distant past. It provides a timeless blueprint for understanding the anatomy of failure in any complex endeavor. The lessons etched into the dusty plains outside Acre are as relevant to a modern CEO navigating a market takeover as they were to a medieval sultan. It teaches us the non-negotiable necessity of preparation for all scenarios, not just the most optimistic one. It screams the importance of building adaptability into the very core of any plan, of creating organizations and strategies that are resilient and responsive rather than rigid and brittle. And perhaps most importantly, it instills in us a crucial sense of humility, the wisdom to recognize our own limits, to know when to pivot, and to understand that no single person, no matter how gifted, can control every variable. True strength lies not in an inflexible will, but in the capacity to listen, to learn, and to adapt to the changing tides of fortune. As we close this chapter on one of history's most fascinating military puzzles, we turn the question over to you. What other historical mysteries capture your imagination? Which moments where brilliance met unexpected failure do you think we should explore next? Share your thoughts and suggestions in the comments below. Your input truly helps shape our journey into the past. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the strategies and struggles of the medieval world, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next adventure.